there are some very profound challenges, both methodological, epistemological, and so on, about the process of counting, measuring, and naming this process in the policy debate. And so we've invited Marc Edelman from Hunter College, CUNY, and Carlos Oyer from SOAS at the University of London, to give some reflections to open the discussion on some of the methodological challenges that are at the center of this discussion. And then we're going to have some reactions from people who've been actively engaged in this process, who are clearly well aware of some of these challenges, and then we want to open up that to a wider debate. And the group who are going to be reacting and reflecting on their own work are Ward Anseeuw from the Land Matrix Partnership, but also from CIRAD and the University of Pretoria, Devlin Kuyek from Grain, and Kimberly Pfeifer from Oxfam, America. Sadly, Klaus Deininger from the World Bank had to travel to the US and has sent his sincere apologies for not being here, because this is an issue that he feels strongly about too. So, without further ado, we're going to kick off with Marc, who's going to give us 10 minutes or so of reflections, and then we'll have Carlos, and then our three other panelists before opening up to the broader audience. So, Marc, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can you hear me in the back? What I'd like to do today is to talk about some reflections that began to occur to me when land grabbing or large-scale land acquisition became a subject of public discussion and debate in the past decade or less. And the reflections grow out of on-the-ground historical and contemporary work that I was doing on land tenure in a couple of different regions of Costa Rica. A small country, small regions, and so on. But they led me to question some of the ways in which we think about contemporary land grabbing. And the foremost impression that one has, having worked on the ground with many different kinds of sources in order to understand land tenure, is of a great deal of ambiguity, a tremendous kind of messiness. And I want to talk about some of the sources of that because I think it has implications for the broader discussion of land grabbing, and particularly for some of the claims that are being made about X number of hectares here and Y number of hectares there. I had basically two different kinds of questions. One is a historical question, the question of, is this new wine in old bottles, essentially? And I want to bracket that question, but I'll just remark very quickly that the scale of what's going on now is quite possibly something new. The biofuels boom is new. The phenomenon of payment for environmental services is somewhat new, red, carbon sequestration, and so on. And the involvement of sovereign wealth funds and state-owned companies is also a new element. But what I'd like to talk about mainly right now is the epistemological question. How do we know what we know? And that's a bit more complicated. In the historical studies that I did in Central America, mainly in Costa Rica, the first thing that you run across is that land titles are often expressed in archaic forms of measurement. The caballeria is a form of measurement that is variously described as the amount of land that you can plow with a horse during a day, as a unit of land that was awarded to conquistadors who served in the cavalry, or it also had equivalents in hectares eventually, but the equivalents in hectares were different from Guatemala to Costa Rica to Nicaragua, and there was also contention over whether these were old caballerias or new caballerias, and so nobody really knows what size it is. Many peasants to this day talk about the size of their holdings in a unit called manzana, which which is about 0.7 hectares. And in Mexico, it's still not that uncommon in smallholding maize areas to use a unit of volume to measure surface area. And this is something, if one reads, for example, Witold Kula's book on measures and man, if you'll pardon the expression, it is widespread around the world. To talk about an area in terms of a measure of volume, which is the volume of seed that you can plant in the area. The surveying techniques were clearly very antiquated until the mid-20th century. Surveyors who didn't know the rudiments of Euclidean geometry, of trigonometry, or anything. So the areas in the titles frequently didn't correspond to the actual areas that were found when they were later surveyed with modern techniques. Boundaries are hugely problematical. They're often specified in titles with markers that move, rivers, old trees that rot and fall down, stone cairns that are made to disappear or actually disappear for various reasons. So boundaries are hugely problematical and oftentimes kind of vague and certainly contested. Many, particularly smaller landowners, don't have any idea of how much land they own. Sometimes they'll say it's 10 manzanas, and the next breath they'll say it's 10 hectares, and so on. And lest you think that this is a peculiarity of Costa Rica or Central America, no. If you look at works like Catherine Bergery's book on Romania, The Vanishing Hectare, exactly the same phenomenon there. So all of this ambiguity provides a context for land grabs. And I'm talking back in the late 19th, early 20th century, provided an opportunity. So how do we know how many hectares are being grabbed? I think a lot of times there is not sufficient attention given to the quality of the sources. We don't know what is behind some of the assertions that are being made. The first question that a historian has to ask of a documentary source is who produced it, why did they produce it, and why is it preserved? Well, we have to ask the same questions of some of the articles that appear, say, in the Financial Times or in Bloomberg News about particular land projects. We also have to be, I think, careful about recycling and aggregating data that is not maybe comparable or that doesn't have the same evidentiary solidity to it. Okay, we can put a whole bunch of numbers together, we get a very big number, and that has a certain kind of political impact, but it also tends, I think, sometimes to produce results that maybe are not so great. So we have the GIGO or seesaw phenomenon, which probably some of you know what that stands for. Garbage in, garbage out. It's a computer science term from back in the Middle Ages of computing. The other thing I think needs to be emphasized is that data sets are not just there in some kind of objective sense, but they have implicit biases in them. Okay? Why were they created? What work do they do for a bureaucracy, for an administration, for a state, for some other entity? We have to figure out ways of identifying and compensating for those biases in the data. And my concern is that some of the aggregators of numbers on land grabs are aware of this problem. There's certainly expressions of doubt, of concern about these sorts of issues, but this hasn't been given serious methodological expression in some of the big databases that are being developed. The other point that led me to reflect on this is it became very clear to me in some work I did that data sets that refer to the same object frequently contradict each other. I did a study with political scientist Mitchell Selix in the south of Costa Rica in the early 90s, and this grew out of an argument that he and I had, and then we decided in good positivist fashion, this is an argument that we can settle through research. So we set out to do a research project looking at the same physical area, which was a county, a canton, a small area, using two different kinds of data for the entire period in which this had been settled
by non-indigenous people, which is roughly 1950 to the mid-80s was the last agricultural census we had. And what we found is there were two completely contradictory pictures that we derived from agricultural census data. And you can see the blue line, it kind of trends upward and then slightly downward at the end. The only reason it trends slightly downward at the end is because there were several large farms that didn't report to the census. And we were able to identify these when we did the work with cadastral survey information, property registry and mercantile registry information. So how do you explain this? It's the politics behind the data set, and this is the article that we did on, in case anyone's interested, the English version and the Spanish version. It was in Hispanic American Historical Review quite some time ago. But what we found is that the agricultural census data had a Gini index trending up over time. The land registry and cadastral data showed a Gini index trending down, and through qualitative research, interviews, looking at archives of the Land Reform Agency, we were able to identify exactly the processes of fragmentation and recuperation by peasants of some of these large properties. So how do we explain this? Well, basically, the larger landowners don't like to report to the census takers. The census takers are school teachers. School teachers tend to be in unions. They're on the left. They're politically suspect. They might tell somebody else that there's a large property up there, so they just don't report to them. And there was also fear that the census was a kind of proxy for the Agrarian Reform Agency, which still was a little bit active at the time we were doing this research, not so much anymore. So they wouldn't report to the census, but they were much more likely to register their lands with the Public Property Registry, with the Cadastral Survey Office, and to have an entry in the Mercantile Registry, which is where corporations register their corporate personality. And they do this for reasons that are pretty obvious. They want to protect against competing claims, and they also want to get credit, because a lot of times you can't do anything with the land, but you can get a nice big loan and then invest it in a factory or a supermarket chain or whatever other way you've diversified your livelihood. So this brings me to thinking about what are our sources of information on land grabs. Well, press reports figure very importantly in this. Maybe especially the Financial Times and a bunch of others. But I think we need to ask the question a little bit more systematically than we have. What are the journalists' sources? Why are they putting this article in there? Did the initiative come from investigative journalism? Did it come because a company planted something in the press, a government agency planted something in the press? A lot of times we don't know the answers to those questions, but those are the kind of questions that a historian would ask. You know, what explains this document? My other concern is, and this is a question really, it's not something I can prove, it's a misgiving, that because the press coverage focuses very heavily on certain areas, it may be that our impression of the global pattern is a little bit skewed toward those areas. The press coverage in the Financial Times focuses very heavily on Africa, for example. There may be reasons that we don't understand or haven't identified that they're not covering other world areas where similar processes are going on. So that's one concern. In looking at the land matrix database in particular, there are a number of references to sources of data used there that are troubling from the point of view of a social scientist who aspires to a certain higher level of rigor. The idea that information from field-based research projects, that sounds very good. I mean, it sounds kind of like what I did back in the day, but it's not clear what those projects are, how they work, or what the kinds of sources are that are employed. And press interviews. One of my concerns here is that it's unusual that people tell the truth about resource issues. I was saying to somebody before, and I still think it's true, that it's easier in an interview to get information about somebody's sex life than it is to get information about their property. And I repeatedly had large and medium-sized landowners in particular lie to me about their holding. It would be interesting to know in the cases where we have contracts, why it is that those contracts were obtainable. Okay, somebody let them out. You know, usually we don't have access to private contracts. How is it that they were let out? And the idea of using crowdsourcing, as it's called, in order to identify land deals, I think is a very interesting approach, but it raises, for me, the Wikipedia problem. You know, that anybody can participate, anybody can edit, anybody can provide information. And we tell our students not to use Wikipedia because it's not a very solid source. And my concern is that this particular approach could be good for a tip-off about what's going on, but it doesn't really get to the level of rigor that maybe we need. A bunch of additional concerns very quickly. There's a lot of slippage in the databases between a proposed project and a project that actually has happened. There are projects that have been scaled back that still sometimes appear. I think the artificial division between international and national investors needs to be scrutinized a little more. And it's not just that capital doesn't have a flag, it's that there are often these very murky alliances that sometimes it's possible to uncover between national capital, between figurehead investors, and so on. There's the problem in land tenure studies everywhere of paper divisions and properties between different corporate entities. And you know, the issue of titling programs, of course, comes up, and it's just, I mean, to me, it's obvious that titling is very much a double-edged sword, that it provides access to credit, but it also provides access to foreclosure. Okay, so does it matter? I think it matters in terms of what is clearly this burgeoning industry of academic land grabbing studies that we're all involved in. It's possible a certain sensationalism advances our careers, gives us access to grant funds and so on, gets attention. But I think more importantly, there's a credibility issue for the civil society organizations that are trying to affect change on the ground in particular cases. They have to have rigorous reality-based data. And I think in the cases of those kinds of struggles, an article in the Financial Times is possibly not sufficient to justify an effort to reverse some kind of project, to make demands for more equitable distribution of land and so on. So I believe my time is past, so I will stop there. Thank you very much. Great.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here, and especially being called by June Bora as a skeptical one. But after Marc's presentation, I actually feel that I'm not going to be the only party pooper here. So there's obviously some overlaps between what Marc said and what I'm going to say, and I will re-emphasize some of the issues, which I think are at the base of this discussion. But let me organize my presentation in terms of a few points. Some of them focused on these aggregate data, large data sets. Some of them more focused on more generally doing empirical research on this particular and very challenging topic. The first point I would like to make about especially the aggregate data in large data sets is what we could call the syndrome of false precision. I haven't invented this term. This is a term that was used in a debate on global poverty indicators. As you know, there is a big debate about whether poverty is going up or going down globally. The World Bank has put huge amounts of resources into this over the last 20 years. And it's a debate that's still there, and partly because some people have argued that the evidence base for this debate is not reliable enough. Sometimes badly conducted national household surveys mixed with dubious methods in the estimation of poverty lines, and so on. So imagine comparing this with a debate that is largely based, to a large extent, on media reports. Marc has mentioned the Financial Times. I've actually looked at many of the sources of these deals. Financial Times is not a very important one. You see a lot of local newspapers whose reliability one could question as much or even more as the Financial Times. So there is indeed, I think, a syndrome of false position in these global statistics as it is with poverty statistics. It is interesting also, there's another parallel that I've noticed in recent years. The land rush has indeed induced a literature rush on land grabs, which is interestingly parallel to another literature rush, not unrelated to this, which is the one on China in Africa. This is another rush which also followed because of interest in the topic in itself, and the parallels are quite striking. How media reports are used as evidence, and how some scholars, notably Deborah Brautigam, have done quite painstaking job in sort of forensic probing of the reliability of these sources. And Deborah's work suggests that we have a serious reliability problem. Another problem that I have that induces me to think in terms of false position is the fact that these data sets mix lots of things. Marc has mentioned apples with bananas, but let me give you some of the sorts of things that are mixed in these large aggregates. First, you do have facts, things that have actually happened and cannot be ignored. I'm not denying there is a land rush going on. Don't misunderstand me. Together with this, you have perceptions, intentions, and plans, not facts. You have guesstimates from informed stakeholders. You have lies. So it's one thing relying on one particular source, on one particular type of data. Another thing is combining all these different data into one aggregate index. Second point on false position relates to not what is being collected by these databases, but also what this is being compared to, i.e. data, official data on land use. And I would like to remind a paper that was published a few years ago by, actually not very known institute, the Center of Environmental Economics and Policy in Africa, Hanners and Lodge, 2006. They gave striking evidence of the huge discrepancies between different sources of data on land use, cropland for Africa, in some cases exceeding, these discrepancies between these different sources exceeded 25% of the total country area. So imagine what that means in terms of these indicators that say there is 10% or 15% of land in Mozambique that is being grabbed. There are also embedded in these methodologies some selection biases, and Marc has already hinted at them, which means that not all countries, not all deals are equally covered. There are particular interests on particular regions in particular countries, and that obviously is inducing a bias that must be acknowledged. The question of checking sources is a very complex and challenging one. Again, Marc will say something about it. I was struck when it was the first time I went to Grain database. I downloaded this Excel file, great for transparency. I have my Excel file with all the columns, the grabber, the country, and so on. I was missing one column with the sources. There was no column with sources for each of these deals. I'm sure they are there, and I'm sure that if I asked Grain, they would give me the sources. But this should also be part of the data set. And it relates to the question that in actually checking these sources is extremely difficult. Deborah Brautigam has shown that this is not an easy exercise, not something that you can do by a quick phone conversation with a trusted friend in Mozambique. It won't happen. And you can find, and of course, when you find a few glaring mistakes, like someone quoted 4 million hectares or 400,000 hectares when we were talking about 4,000 hectares, this kind of mistakes are not that uncommon, and Deborah has shown that that's the case. Also, there's a question of the snowball, what I call the snowball effect, i.e. when one number is quoted by one source, then re-quoted, retweeted, put on Facebook, and so on until it becomes public truth. And then the large data sets take it as a sort of evidence. Again, when you look at China stories in Africa, there's plenty of examples of that. And the problem is that the verification process, which I acknowledge, land metrics has been making efforts in that direction, the verification process is a problematic and troublesome one, as Marc was suggesting before. So these are my considerations about this issue of false precision and why we should be very careful about how you use evidence or what you call data and facts. So that leads me to a second point, second question, which is, okay, so why land grab databases then? What's the point of them? Should we just scrap them? Okay, let me just unpack this question in 3 parts. So first, these data sets can be useful as a provider of what people call killer facts, or the spectacle that was mentioned yesterday. And in that sense, it is certainly useful, and I'm sure that the underlying reason for these data sets is precisely to provide these killer facts. But the issue of cross-checking verification becomes of paramount importance. I'm going to quote not a sort of radical Marxist who doesn't like this kind of unrigorous data. I'm going to quote Duncan Green, the strategic advisor to Oxfam. He says in one of his blogs, when he lists the do's and don'ts in dealing with killer facts, one of the don'ts is, don't use a killer fact that is not credibly sourced. Even if it fits your message, it is not worth damaging your credibility for a quick hit. I think that's quite remarkable, and he definitely makes the point and takes the message quite clearly. So if forensic probing shows that some of these global numbers on land grabs are only guesstimates, are a mixture of lies and facts, then there is a real risk that these campaigns will be discredited. And so will any counter movements sharing the same message, but not necessarily the same evidence. Second possible use of these data sets as a source of data for statistical analysis. Well, I will apply the GIGO, CISO adage mentioned by Marc before. I can think of an example of one of the panelists who is not here, published recently an IMF paper on in trying to regress why, in this case, this land grab data coming from these data sets, on a set of indicators, some of which were actually coming from the data criticized by the paper that I mentioned before, and getting some statistically significant correlations. Third use of these data sets as sources of examples for case study research. I guess that's probably, if you want to be fair, that's a good use of the data set. Someone who wants to start research on land grabs looks at the data set and can pick some interesting, relevant examples. What is the problem with that? If you actually show that there is some underlying bias in terms of the regions, areas, and types of deals covered, that is also going to drive a bias towards what sorts of cases are selected by individual researchers. And that bias needs to be understood. So I think it's, how much do I have? 2 minutes, 3 minutes? Let me just raise very quickly and without developing a number of additional points which go beyond this aggregate and data and indicators. It's more about the actual research that is being done on an emerging land grab literature. And in reading a lot of this literature, I found a number of challenges and situations which have worried me. I have seen quite a bit of instances of serious mismatch between evidence presented and the claims made. When you read the main body of the paper, and then you read the conclusions, and you see that there are serious problems. As a journal editor, I take this quite seriously. In fact, we tend to reject papers that fall in this kind of trap. I'm also quite struck, but not surprised, by the lack of baseline evidence. If one is serious about addressing quantitative impacts, and a lot of people are interested in quantitative impacts, why not trying to do quite a lot of serious research and trying to get some baseline evidence, since a lot of these deals are either underway or planned? That would allow you, in 5-10 years' time, to say something more or less reasonable or rigorous about what's really happening on the ground. And I see there's a scarcity of this kind of effort, and I wonder why this is the case. The other point is that when you read some of these literature, and I'm not trying to generalize, this is some cases, but that raise deep concerns, a lot of the claims and the mismatch between the evidence of the claims actually reflect underlying problematical conceptual and empirical dichotomies, which are not very helpful in terms of advancing debates on these complex issues. Let me give you examples of these dichotomies where the first term is usually regarded as good and desirable, and the second term as bad and undesirable. Small versus large, we've seen this. Family farming versus capitalist farming. National domestic versus foreign. Local versus outsider. And interestingly here, it's not just about the state and the capital as outsider. I've even seen examples where the presence of migrant workers was seen as a threat, as something bad. Food versus export, self-employment versus agricultural wage employment, subsistence versus market-oriented. I really don't think that reality reflects this kind of dichotomies. It is actually, unfortunately, for those who do research, much more complex and grey. And advancing a certain message should not try to rely necessarily on these dichotomies. Fourth point, when it comes to impact, and I think this was mentioned by some people yesterday, and remember Phil Woodhouse in one of the papers also raised this question, we do need to bring labor and exploitation back into the analysis. This is not just about land. I've heard many people saying that land is everything. Well, no. Labor is a lot as well. And that raises the question of why the focus on land only. Is land everything to the poor? The reality is that we live under capitalism, and under capitalism you have very varied and contradictory layers of exploitation. You do have exploitation by large-scale farmers, agribusiness, of wage workers. You do have exploitation by small-scale farmers and casual wage workers. You do have exploitation via exchange relations by traders. You do have exploitation within the household, what some people call self-exploitation, which usually translates in the exploitation of women and youth, which often is very closely related to instances of conflict, not least, conflicts. If you read Paul Richards on conflict in Sierra Leone or Liberia, pretty much of the conflict was agrarian-based, rooted in intra-household conflicts, intergenerational conflicts. So these are not unproblematic, these are not simple issues. Okay, let me just say the final thing, which I also found a little bit disturbing, and as a social scientist and also I teach research methods at SOAS, so I keep saying this all the time at the end of my course, is the need for reflexivity. As researchers, but also I guess as activists, one could say, we're constantly managing the challenging interactions between ideology, our ideological premises, assumptions, our underlying assumptions about what is desirable or not, and what is reality, fact and method. Managing these complex interactions is definitely not easy, but they're not shortcuts to the management of these interactions. So when we do research on these issues, we need to be quite open and clear about whose part we are taking. Are we taking the part of the locals? Are we taking the part of the people of the land? Are we taking the part of anyone who is anti-capitalist? Are we taking the part of peasant farmers? Are we taking the part of perhaps the poorest of the poor, wage workers who have absolutely no interest in farming? Well, I'm sure that some of us are taking the part of all of these people, but not maybe some of them more than others. So we need to be very aware of these problems and our own positionality. And need to just to remind something that I learned from, I heard many times from Professor Marc Voigt from ISS. When you do quantitative research, you have to constantly retreat from your own assumptions or your own hypotheses. Don't stop at the moment where you get your finding. Try to discredit your own finding. Try to find ways of being devil's advocate, and then you will probably advance a little bit more. Just to end, I think all these methodological issues are not simply academic. And let me say why. There is a real danger that by not addressing these issues, some radical and critical academics will be alienated and will not be part of these debates. Those who know, the evolution of the left know about the fragmentation and the sectarianism of the left. The orthodox Marxists, the Trotskyists, the Maoists, the Stalinists, the Warrenites, the populists, the Greens, and so on. Well, these methodological issues are very much at the heart of some of these fragmentation. And secondly, there is a real danger of discrediting the struggles by using poor quality evidence. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marc. and Carlos for a set of very provocative challenges to us all here. Now we're not going to put you guys completely on the spot here, because to some extent what we were hoping is that this would be a moment for that type of reflexivity that Carlos was urging us. I mean, all of these issues are ones that people involved in the land matrix and in Grain and Oxfam have thought about. I mean, of course. But for us, as a research community, as an activist community, as people engaged in forwarding this debate, we're all committed to the type of ideals that you've expressed. The question for us collectively is where we go from here at this moment in this particular debate, and how we use some of these cautions and challenges to move that forward. So we're going to ask Ward first, and then Devlin, and then Kimberly to have some quick reflections on how they've been struggling with these very particular issues.
Thanks, Ian.
You have to speak quite into it.
Okay. I'm not going to try to respond to these two discussants, mainly because we tend to agree, I think, all of us, with much of what you said, or even with everything what you said. Just a small comment before starting. Also, would have liked the comments of the World Bank and of Klaus, that was invited here today, because we've received in the last couple of days quite some critique from the World Bank, to which I would have loved to respond here. But he's apparently on mission. So I will present what the Land Matrix on behalf of the Land Matrix Partnership, and I will detail here what we've done, where we come from, and where we're going. And I think some of the aspects, that, especially where we're going, are responding to some of your critiques, and the critiques we've received in the last couple of months since the launch of the Land Matrix. First, a word on the Land Matrix Partnership and of this initiative. It is an initiative that includes 5 institutions. That is CDE, Center for Development and Environment, related to the University of Bern in Switzerland; CIRAD, the French research organization in agriculture and rural development; GIGA, the German Institute for Global Areas Studies; ILC, the International Land Coalition; and GIZ, BMZ, the German corporation. So all of them are equally partners in this partnership. So the Land Matrix is a tool to trace, identify, document, and verify, so try to verify, the data, or the evolving set of data we have on this untransparent phenomena that is land grab. And I want to make 3 points first, before going to how we do it. First one is, it is a crowdsourcing instrument. So we depend on everybody that engages or works or is affected by this phenomenon. And through the Land Matrix, through the website, you can add, everybody can add information on specific deals, on the issues, or can criticize and contribute to the Land Matrix directly. That forms, together with some of the portals that exist, the Grain one, but also the land portal of the ILC, the major source of information that we are gathering in the Land Matrix. Secondly, we try to verify, or we try to triangulate the information. So the information that is on the website, that you can find when you click on any of the deals, is not the big mass of information we get out there, but it's information that is being verified. We call verified or triangulated. So the information on the web is only the verified and triangulated information. And thirdly, it is a broad website. It's not only on agriculture, it also includes other sectors. It is transnational, but also domestic, and we started from 2010 onwards. Lately, we tend to focus a bit more on domestic and on agriculture, but that's mainly related to the media and the information we are getting through our crowdsourcing instrument. So we launched the first phase of the Land Matrix in April at a land conference in Washington at the World Bank. That was the launch of our first phase. And this first phase was based on a verification and a cross-checking of the information based on 4 levels. The first level is level 0. It's all the information we are gathering through the crowdsourcing, through the media, everything we've been talking about. And then we have 3 other levels, 1, 2, and 3. The first level is information that has been verified through the research, through the fieldwork. We've been talking about it. We call it level 1, so the less verified information. The second one is information we are gathering through our networks of ILC and the other partners that are participating in the project on the field. We go out there, we get the geographical indicators, we have precise information, we've seen the projects, etc. And then the third one is the highest level of veracity of the information for us is when we get the contracts, when we have enterprises or companies publishing the deals or the projects on their website, or government publishing them. Out of all the information that we have, about 50% is published. So out of all the deals we are gathering through the crowdsourcing and all this information, those cross-analyzed and cross-verified is about 50% of the deals that are out there. So what is visible by you is about 50% of the information and the deals we have. Of course, the objective of the Land Matrix Partnership is to verify or non-verify all these deals, that information, but the 50% that is left. Since the launch in Washington, the success was enormous. We've been cited all over. I think we have more than 50 pages of references. Lately, today, again, there's 3 references in the press about the Land Matrix. We've had thousands and thousands of comments of people using the crowdsourcing instrument. Way too much for us to deal with the small team we were at the moment. So we try, but we can't at the moment absorb the enormous amount of information that we're getting, positive but also negative. For example, the ones of the land. The contributions helped a lot, positive and negative, but there's a lot of complications, and some of them have been detailed here. I can give you some other important ones that are linked to the non-transparency of the deals, linked to the conflicting information, sometimes from very same sources or institutions, and certainly related to the continuous change in the dynamics of these deals. And that's probably the most important aspect, the difficulty we have. And also, it was presented here, the objectives and the way how these sizes, for example, are measured. And I can, for example, if I give you the example of the ways we are getting information on just a size of one deal, we have about 12 different, we identified about 12 different ways to tell us how big one investment is. It goes from the size in the contract or the size of the demand of the investor up to the size of the impact of it or the size of the productions, etc., etc. It is 12 different ways that we have to try to put in one variable. So that brings me to the second phase. The second phase was planned to be launched 1st of October, but due to some amount of work and some delays, it will probably be sometimes in November, maybe beginning of December. And besides the continuous verification of the information that is ongoing, we've tried to answer or to address several of the issues that we were sent. I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through the 2 major ones. And the first one, the first change, is that we will not represent in the second phase of the land matrix, the deals according to the level of verification, the 0, 1, 2, and 3. But we will now represent them or present them according to the source. So that's one of the issues you've mentioned. The second one is we will add, and now we have added, a category, a variable that will better present the categorization of the status and the processes, or the progress, sorry, of the deals. So these are the 2 major ones. because we first had, we've been criticized, related, or had difficulties about the level of veracity, so the 1, 2, and 3, and mainly the 1, because in the 1, like I said, it's data that we think can be considered as verified when it comes out of research reports and field studies. And we've seen that at the end, we started to verify all the results of all the research reports out there, and there's huge mistakes in there, or contradictions, perhaps not mistakes, but contradictions, or information that doesn't reflect other sources, etc. And we couldn't spend the time and take responsibility for the mistakes in these reports. So we will not do this anymore. We will add the source precisely, and then it's for the user, of course, to deal with and take responsibility if he uses it further. Secondly, also, documents, for example, and government websites, etc., are sometimes totally contradictory. We have contracts, different contracts of projects with different sizes, etc., and how do we deal with this? So we couldn't take responsibility for this anymore, so we will post the sources. Secondly, a better categorization of the statuses. Main critique from the land bank is that we overestimate it because we do not deal with deals that are collapsed. So they are still in the website. For example, the Daewoo case in Madagascar is still in there. But there's a good reason, I'll come back to this. So in the second phase, we will keep these deals, but we will detail the next column what the state or the degree or the progress of these deals are, from under negotiations up to fail, whatever it is. But this brings us to even more work, because that means that all these deals, the entire database, has to be followed in real time. That means not only we have to go out there and verify and cross-verify these informations, we have to be updated on a daily or weekly or on a monthly basis. And it's a huge amount of work at the moment we're going through. And it's really it's hell. So we are launching the second phase. The second phase now at the end of the year. We at the moment working on the third phase already. First of all, there's two major issues we are dealing with there, or we're trying to develop. It's a mechanism of continuous follow-up, because we can't do it ourselves. It's 200 at the moment, 2,000 deals we have in the land matrix. We can't follow them on. So we are trying to establish a mechanism to do this through our networks, etc. This will be done through two mechanisms: satellite imagery, I'm just finalizing, but also through setting up a broad network in every country, at the moment mainly in Africa. We are setting up with the African Union and UNECA a portal of the land matrix that will be owned by UNECA itself. And we will work through the LPI initiative and will anchor the land matrix through the focal points of the LPI, which will lead to a better flow of information on continuous follow-up of these deals, but also will allow UNECA and African Union to own their information, etc. I think it's a very important part. And then secondly, we will try to bring the land matrix closer to the ground. We always speak about the global image. We will link implement in 5 countries at this stage case studies of all the projects in certain countries, where we will also analyze the processes, social aspects of it, etc., that will be integrated in the land matrix. But again, we will not be able to do it for all the countries and for all the deals. It's just not possible. But it's just some case studies, some pilot countries that will allow us to get some information, comparative in nature, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know Brain, we're a small organization. We're 8 people sort of scattered around the planet. We work on various things. One of the things we work on is trying to identify developments in global agribusiness. that have impacts on people's control over their biodiversity. So particularly things that impact local food systems, bigger trends that impact local food systems, that impact on people's livelihoods, rural people's livelihoods. And we were doing quite a bit of work on the food crisis in 2007, 2008. And one of the things we started to notice was reports of diplomatic missions or companies that were traveling to various parts of the world looking to acquire large areas of land. And this was something new. It wasn't anything that we had seen before. It was clearly a reaction to something. And so we tried to put our finger on it, and we were following it, and eventually, you know, there was a number of examples. And so, as we normally do, we tried to just share that with the world. Yeah, the first thing we did was a report in 2008 called Seized. And their goal was to outline some of the examples that were being reported on and give it a bit of a frame. So we talked about things I think that really still hold today. The fact that this was driven by a food security agenda on one hand, various countries, and that it was also there was a business agenda. Something had changed, and with the financial crisis, and that there was a business interest now in acquiring large areas of farmland overseas to produce food. Is there a technician that can deal? Sorry, it was totally working beforehand.
Yeah,
anyways, well that's getting
I'm
on.
not the person to do, just carry on.
Yeah, the first thing we did was a report in 2008 called Seized. And their goal was to outline some of the examples that were being reported on and give it a bit of a frame. So we talked about things I think that really still hold today. The fact that this was driven by a food security agenda on one hand, various countries, and that it was also there was a business agenda. Something had changed, and with the financial crisis, and that there was a business interest now in acquiring large areas of farmland overseas to produce food. And in this case, there had been already, you know, it's actually frozen, I think. Yeah. Oh, that's unfortunate. I love visuals. So the idea was to give it a frame and put out the information, which we did in 2008. And a lot of that, of course, came from media sources. The one thing to understand with this is so much of this is happening in circles of power where most people don't have access to the information. And a lot of things have been said about Pro Savannah, for instance, in Mozambique right now. People on the ground still don't actually know about the project, even though it's been reported on in the Financial Times, in Valor Económico, and various local news sources in Mozambique. People there still don't have access to the information. So subsequently to doing that first report, one of the things we tried to do was to create a place, a platform, a resource that people could have access to information on this topic, where groups like us who were working on this issue could post any news that we thought was relevant, articles we saw, if we got a hold of contracts somehow, which was very difficult to do. If you got a hold of a contract, that you could post it, people could look at it. You can put up images of the investors so people can put a face to it. It's categorized by the investor, it's categorized by country, so it's easy to look through. Different languages are available there. So you create a resource, and this is an open publishing resource. I'm talking about farmlandgrab.org, where it can be a sort of a central place for people to get information on the topic. We did then, in 2009, because we felt there was quite a bit of attention being paid to the food security agenda, so countries like what the Chinese were up to, what the Gulf countries were up to, and very little attention being paid to the financial investors. So again, we started to compile what was out there, what the information that we had about the various farmland funds that were being set up, and this is a combination of media reports. It's going to a couple investor conferences. You dig into the websites of these corporations. You try to find statements. You try to find press releases. You do what you can to get that information. You put it together, and then we released another data set. with no intentions of it being anything comprehensive or being, this is the gospel truth, but it being a collection of the information that's out there that gives people a sense of who the actors are, so that you can react. And we don't care to do post-mortem analysis. What we do care to do is to stimulate action, to provoke, to help people so that they can identify some of the actors, so they can understand, for instance, if you're an activist in India, that there are Indian companies that are now active in Africa, and this changes things when it comes to activism in India. These kind of dynamics are what we're interested in stimulating. We also did afterwards a table that put together pension funds with the same idea. And pension funds are a major actor. They hold significant assets, and there was a lot of these pension funds at these investor conferences considering the idea of investing in farmland. Some of them were investing in farmland. And so again, you try to pull together that information based on what you think is credible information, pull it together in a way so that people can understand that, yes, this is an important development, these are important actors. And now you do have coalitions that are working together in various places trying to take on their pension funds, talk with unions, talk with those who are the contributors about what these investments are all about. We did also, because there had been, and part of what had happened too was the World Bank was always talking about this big study that they were going to do that would involve a process of verification because they have access to the centers of power. So they were going to put together a big database that would have a clear number on how much hectares was involved, which never really happened. And the report that the World Bank put out was based on what was on farmlandgrab.org, so mostly media releases. There was very little on the ground verification. A lot of the stuff that we thought would have been very relevant, such as where are these investors coming from and who are they, was excluded. There's a lot of questions as to what was presented, and certainly a lot of questions as to why they couldn't get, with the resources that the bank has, a better accounting of the information. So time passed, and we again thought that it would be important to try to pull together some of the studies that were out there, some of the information that was out there, into a new table. And again, it was partly we were waiting for the matrix, and the matrix was taking a long time too. So we put together another table. This one had about 400 some cases. I think most of the cases have pretty good sources. The references actually, and probably make us swipe back at you, there is a line right above the table that says, please get in touch with us for the references, and we do have that, so if anybody is interested. But the idea being, again, that there was, so much had been happening, so many studies. Here's a way to compile the information so that people can use it. And because when you have a huge mess of information that's out there, it's actually very difficult for social movements to engage with that information. A lot of it can be combined in you can take that information and do very interesting visual stuff with it. You can do very interesting training materials with it. There's what is very important, I think, is to understand with that presentation of information how there's a real lack, the social movements on the ground have a real lack of access to that information that is sitting with those centers of power. And that when you get that kind of information, it is so important to let it out. I mean, one of the problems I have at this conference is that you can react. And we don't care to do post-mortem analysis. What we do care to do is to stimulate action, to provoke, to help people so that they can identify some of the actors, so they can understand, for instance, if you're an activist in India, that there are Indian companies that are now active in Africa, and this changes things when it comes to activism in India. These kind of dynamics are what we're interested in stimulating. We also did afterwards a table that put together pension funds with the same idea. And pension funds are a major actor. They hold significant assets, and there was a lot of these pension funds at these investor conferences considering the idea of investing in farmland. Some of them were investing in farmland. And so again, you try to pull together that information based on what you think is credible information, pull it together in a way so that people can understand that, yes, this is an important development, these are important actors. And now you do have coalitions that are working together in various places trying to take on their pension funds, talk with unions, talk with those who are the contributors about what these investments are all about. We did also, because there had been, and part of what had happened too was the World Bank was always talking about this big study that they were going to do that would involve a process of verification because they have access to the centers of power. So they were going to put together a big database that would have a clear number on how much hectares was involved, which never really happened. And the report that the World Bank put out was based on what was on farmlandgrab.org, so mostly media releases. There was very little on the ground verification. A lot of the stuff that we thought would have been very relevant, such as, where are these investors coming from and who are they, was excluded. There's a lot of questions as to what was presented, and certainly a lot of questions as to why they couldn't get, with the resources that the bank has, a better accounting of the information. So time passed, and we again thought that it would be important to try to pull together some of the studies that were out there, some of the information that was out there, into a new table. And again, it was partly we were waiting for the matrix, and the matrix was taking a long time too. So we put together another table. This one had about 400 some cases. I think most of the cases have pretty good sources. The references actually, and Carl, make a swipe back at you, there is a line right above the table that says, please keep in touch with us for the references, and we do have that, so if anybody is interested. But the idea being, again, that there was, so much had been happening, so many studies. Here's a way to compile the information so that people can use it. And because when you have a huge mess of information that's out there, it's actually very difficult for social movements to engage with that information. A lot of it can be combined in you can take that information and do very interesting visual stuff with it. You can do very interesting training materials with it. There's what is very important, I think, is to understand with that presentation of information how there's a real lack, the social movements on the ground have a real lack of access to that information that is sitting with those centers of power. And that when you get that kind of information, it is so important to let it out. I mean, one of the problems I have at this conference is I've sat through very good presentations, very clear presentations, but very careful presentations. A lot of the information that would be really relevant to the work that we do would be to have some sense of, say, your conversations maybe with some government officials, some companies, who let go of some information that actually has huge impacts on the people on the ground, that those people can use to question their governments about. And we've seen this in many cases where communities get that access to the information. They question the governments. They protest over it. They want to know what's going on, and sometimes those deals get scaled back once the light is exposed. So I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, David. So information for who and why? I mean, very key points there about how we deploy information and its and in what form. Kimberly. Okay. Are you doing just notes? Okay.
Will this work?
Yep.
So we all know that land grabs, competing claims to land, conflict over land is not new. It's been happening long before any of us were here, and we've been saying that over and over again at this conference. I personally have been thinking about competing land claims and conflicts for almost 2 decades. And Oxfam has been working on land issues for decades at different periods of time. But about 6 years ago, Oxfam decided it was going to campaign on agricultural issues. That was driven, or came out of our work on our Make Trade Fair campaign. We felt that that made sense as a natural evolution from what we were hearing from our partners that we work with, and also from criticism that we were receiving from various places. And so we began a consultation process with partners across our programming, across various countries, across 3 continents, about how we would campaign on agriculture. What should we work on? One of the issues that consistently came up, whether in Latin America or in Africa, in different parts of Asia, was land. That land and natural resource use were very important issues, and were issues that brought up a whole host of social relations and social problems, and that they had real implications for people's lives, and people felt their livelihoods under threat as a result of land issues. But we tried to think about then taking that very real issue at that local level up those various levels to provincial, national, regional, and even global levels. And within Oxfam, people struggled with, how are we going to campaign on land? How do you make that real? How do you make people care about it? And then all of a sudden, there was this talk in the media about a global land rush. And all of a sudden, all this attention to large-scale land acquisitions. And that seemed to present us with an opportunity to figure out how to work on land. And so we saw that as an opportunity to begin our work on land, another version of our work on land. And we even supported the work of the ILC in that. That got us involved in the Land Matrix project that you heard about. It even got us involved in helping the Land Matrix project verify all of that information. It got us involved in voluntary guidelines. It got us involved in trying to create or trying to produce reports and case studies on very specific cases of land grabbing or conflict around land, and sharing them with different audiences to generate interest in reform or change around land issues. And so today I just want to quickly sort of responding to what I'm hearing from Marc and Carlos, and echo some of those concerns, just a few points that I think of in terms of maybe
what was on farmlandgrab.org. So mostly media releases. There was very little on the ground verification. A lot of the stuff that we thought would have been very relevant, such as, where are these investors coming from and who are they, was excluded. There's a lot of questions as to what was presented, and certainly a lot of questions as to why they couldn't get, with the resources that the bank has, a better accounting of the information. So time passed, and we again thought that it would be important to try to pull together some of the studies that were out there, some of the information that was out there, into a new table. And again, it was partly we were waiting for the matrix, and the matrix was taking a long time too. So we put together another table. This one had about 400 some cases. I think most of the cases have pretty good sources. The references actually, and Carl, make a swipe back at you, there is a line right above the...
Derek, and then Phil, and then we're going to go.
Hi, Derek Hall from Wilfrid Laurier University. I just wanted to pick up on one of the false dichotomies that Carlos mentioned, which is the one between large and small. And it seems to me that if you want to put together an inventory of land grab cases, you need to have a lower limit, right? Like how small can cases be? Obviously, you can't pick up every 10th hectare anywhere around the world. I think that practical issue matches up with the fact that most of us assume that land grabbing is something that's done on a large scale, large scale individual cases by states, corporations, large farmers. The problem with this is that one of the fundamental dynamics of global agrarian change over the last 300 years
Thanks, Phil McMichael from Cornell. The title of the panel is, well, first of all, thank you very much. A fascinating set of questions that you've raised, but I want to raise a very different question. The panel is entitled Methodologies Identifying, Counting, and Understanding. And I want to argue that the focus of the panel runs the risk of basically rareifying land and short-circuiting the politics that we need to engage in. So, for example, Carlos mentioned various categorical foci that some of us may have, and I would argue that all of those categories need to be historicized. Marc made an attempt to briefly historicize the land grab compared to the 19th century, but largely through an empirical emphasis, where he mentioned scale, biofuels, sovereign wealth funds, etc. And what I wanted to argue is that all of these three categories, for example, have a certain historical specificity in this particular conjuncture. And secondly, that they're fundamentally relational categories. The sovereign wealth funds, biofuels, scale can't be sort of separated from one another as kind of attributes. So we need to look at those kinds of relationships. And one of the ways in which we can do that is, I think, is through taking a look at the crisis conjuncture that occurred in the 2000s. Now, whether you understand it as a material crisis or a discursive crisis, it doesn't really matter. The point is that all of these categories, I think, have to be sort of situated and understood through that kind of specification. And of course, as Bashad would argue, one would then want to sort of situate them in the longue durée also. So, for example, if you have biofuel mandates, the drivers that we're talking about, biofuel mandates, carbon credits, financialization, politically constructed land markets where you have sovereign wealth funds involved, or even the concept of the yield gap that Tanya introduced yesterday. This is an interpretation from the development industry. It's a form of rhetoric. We have to ask, what's the function of that rhetoric in this historical moment? Why is it being used, and why are people accepting it on face value? So all of these issues, I think, are really important, and so we need to sort of take account of the particular threshold that we're at, and that's understanding the land grab means that we need to situate it critically, and not only to understand it, but also to contest it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. Very interesting conversation. And one question that is obvious and that came out very strongly, I think, in the panel is why is it collecting data? I think there's two completely different sets of concerns here, in general and on the panel. One is promoting accountability, and the other one is research, understanding what's really happening. And I think part of the problem arises when the two aims are mixed, and data that is collected for accountability purposes ends up using for understanding scale, trends, and drivers. And so keeping the two distinct, I think, is to me quite important. I suspect that if Brain had not published that report in 2008, fewer of us would be here today. So the power of putting information out with the aim of putting an issue on the table and raising awareness, I think, is very important. As far as research is concerned, I'm wondering really whether it really matters. I mean, to me, we'll never get to one number that says this is the scale of the phenomenon. Many reasons that have been discussed at the panel, or reasons that haven't been discussed at the panel, each single deal has many different sizes. meeting so we can discuss it. But does it matter that if it's 50 million worldwide, if it's 200 million worldwide, methodologically what interests me is how can we find ways of measuring how the yields are increasing pressures on the land, whatever they are. And we find that in some contexts, even 50 hectares can actually have very significant implications to people's lives. So that's, I think, to me, is really a big challenge for researchers like ourselves moving forward. How do we do that in a way that tells us something new and that perhaps makes the importance of these sort of global figures somewhat less important.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Useful. Yeah. Steve?
Hi, I'm Marc from West Virginia University. I was just thinking to myself about how land grabbing has become the new spotlight issue. And in the 1990s, it was corporate accountability and anti-sweatshop movement, and the question was, where's the data? With fair trade in early 2000s, where's the data? Where is the injustice happening? And now we've turned to land grabs. And one of the things that I was thinking as we were listening to the panelists was, does capital care? Whether the data is right. And ultimately, speculation within these markets is driven by data that is all about trying to recruit people to invest. And I think the thing with the issue-based politics, whether it's the anti-sweatshop movement, whether it's fair trade, or whether it's now land grabs, is that when we communicate to audiences as to what is driving this process, it's not just land, it's not just the issue of land, but it's capital mobility, it's the movement of capital, and does the data, politically, I guess, more so than research, does the data matter? I mean, what are we trying to prove with the data, I guess is the question. Is it just that land is important, or land grabbing is a big issue, or are we illustrating rather the broader patterns of capitalist accumulation?
Yeah, your turn. My turn? Yeah, okay.
Actually, my comment, my name is Adrian, I'm with the University of Washington. My comment is intended to link both the methodological issues and the issue of activism. And I struggle with this all the time. This issue of credibility and the pursuit of getting the right number. I'm wondering if sometimes we're not both disarming ourselves and those we intend to help by continually pushing this rigor issue, right? I mean, there's a point at which rigor doesn't do anything for you anymore. And I would just like, on that reflexivity issue, to open it up to the panel for discussion as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Diane, I think it's in the dark back there.
Okay, first of all, what he said, even though I could be rigorous, but it could kill you. The other thing I wanted to raise is already raised by the previous speaker, but I think it would be important to think about for the people that are documenting this, to make it available to people that might want to know and act upon it, considering the source. And I'm interested that we not just use the size of the land that's being taken, but that we be capable of recognizing territorial megaprojects that are written up as such by governments, that are in their own documents. You can show the sources, and these are things that involve very tiny purchases, but they are territorial grants of grand proportions.
Great. Any further ones on this side? Otherwise, we'll give this Matthias and oh, sorry, Ian, go on quickly.
Ian Scoones, University of Wisconsin. I think one of the things that we've been talking a lot about here at this conference is as we've done more research and got more into this issue, the specificity of different places that we're working. And I think one of the things that didn't come up, and I have a lot of sympathy for things that everyone said here on this panel, but there is big differences in different parts of the world on how easy it is to get data and how difficult. And yet we've been speaking of rigor as something that's sort of the same everywhere. And I think we have to take into account how difficult it is to get data in some places and that it's much easier to get data in other places. And this is a really important point, because otherwise we're in danger of just globalizing this issue of rigor in the same way that there's been some critiques of globalizing the issue of the land deal issue in itself. So I think this is something that is worth considering.
Okay, we're going to Ben quickly, and then we'll have David to finish, and then we're going to give the...
There's lots of different kinds of research for different purposes. And some is short-term, necessarily quick and dirty. but others are long-term and need to be very rigorous, both empirically and conceptually. And there's probably something in the middle. So isn't it a question not of which one is better, but actually how to combine them in a research agenda? And so I wonder if somebody couldn't write a position paper which creates a kind of tentative research agenda over the needs in the short term, needs in the medium term, needs in the long term, and sets up some critical questions as a kind of resource for this community.
That's an interesting idea. It's Devlin, and then we're going to ask the panel to give 30 seconds reflections.
Statistical from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Mine is just a straight reaction to Devlin's final comment on sort of encouraging researchers to share kind of the data that we get from interviews and so on. So I have a comment and a question. I mean, how useful is the data if that data is kind of separated from the place where it has been gathered? Because I think that one of the key principles, at least for me when I do research, is confidentiality. And when you work on these highly politicized issues, and I just put you an example, I recently worked with a postgrad student in the Tana Delta in Kenya. We anonymized, we invented the names of the villages because of the high political risks of actually using real names. And I'm glad we did so, because actually a few weeks after the research, you know, there was huge violence and a lot of people were killed. So to which extent would be really useful to share that data if I suddenly cannot tell you whose farmer has told me that? Thank you.
We're going to ask the panelists just to have a brief reflection on some of the issues raised. I mean, clearly there's a lot. We could have had a whole conference about this very subject easily. So we've just touched the surface here, but in a useful way, I think. And I think some productive suggestions are emerging. But let's go down the row here and ask Ward to have a reflection first.
Just some quick answers, and we can take the debate further tonight. On bias, there's a lot of biases in the information on regions, but mainly on the type of investors and the country where the investors are coming from, and I think China has been mentioned. But the land matrix data allows to get beyond this. If you take the announced deals in the land matrix, China is probably the second country here in the land matrix. If you go to the verified data, China is not even in the 21st ones. So, and it gives you a good sense of what the information is about, the biases, but also if you go beyond it, the practices of the countries, etc. So it is quite interesting to analyze the information in such a database. About framing the large-scale land acquisition phenomenon, it's a major issue. We've been dealing with it continuously. We've been changing definitions. We've been adopting it. The difficulty was that if we change the definition, how much data in the land matrix would change, and it would, of course, have an impact on the credibility of the information that was brought down before, etc. So we are sometimes stuck in between. There's a trade-off of the decisions we make, etc. Is capital interested? Yes, they are. We've been contacted by several private investors. They've been asking to participate in the land matrix. Sometimes it comes with conditions from these private investors, like developing a land matrix norm or certificate or whatever. We are thinking about it. We haven't engaged with it. They can engage with the land matrix. It's a crowdsourcing instrument, so they can do like anybody else and contribute. But there have been requests from several private investors. There have been requests from several governments to participate. And so it's not an easy thing. There's a lot of questions behind ethics. How do we work with it? Of autonomy and independency of the tools that we are dealing with. But we take it seriously, and we might reflect on these collaborations.
Maybe I'll pick up there. I can comment on the capital mobility one also, because I think that is quite interesting and worth exploring more. And I think our work on land grabs and large-scale land acquisitions has indeed led us to think about those issues more. And a colleague of mine is here, Emmanuel Tumusime, and he, I don't know if he presented already, if his presentation is tomorrow, I believe tomorrow, but he has been doing some work on looking at US private equity flows, but definitely the issue of land takes you into thinking about capital accumulation, and it is something that should be explored and thought about more, particularly in the development community, I think. And the issue of different kinds of research for different purposes is, I think, a really important one that we think about a lot at Oxfam. That there are, as you said, there's quick and dirty research that you need to do, and there's more rigorous and research that's going to take you multiple years to do, and they have their value for different reasons, and we try to think at Oxfam of research as a strategic endeavor, and what kinds do you use and when, because I think it is very important to think of the combination and what it gives you. And it's also about what those issues we're talking about right now, just the quantification, sort of quantitative and qualitative methods, and when you use them and what strategic value they have. So, a couple of things.
Leah had a question about who uses it. I don't have stats with me here, but if you think about farmlandgrab.org, it's very, very wide spectrum. It goes from land grabbers themselves to the World Bank to activists to media. Media uses it a lot. But then, of course, all those things get translated, and that's, I think, the point, is they get, the information gets picked up and translated in various ways and gets through, there's countless ways that we work with different organizations and movements to try to translate that information into something that can get used at the grassroots. And that's what's most important. And then the question about sharing information. I think there's many ways to share information as your research goes on. I mean, the land grabs are a current issue. It's something that's taking place. So if you are working with social movements in your research, it's quite easy to share the information and even to maintain, I think, confidentiality. I wasn't meaning to make it public, in a big way. I mean, just developing networks where you can share the results that of your research, or things that you're picking up just because you're present and you have access to information that other people don't have when there's a certain focus.
Thanks a lot for the questions. It was very, very rich debate. I'll only just deal with some of them, which I found very substantive. I think the point made by Lorenzo is quite important. We need to distinguish between accountability and research. To this, I would add, accountability to whom as well, and where do you focus when you talk about accountability? I've done much of my research in the past 15 years on casual and seasonal wage workers in different parts of Africa, many of them working for smallholders. Should I create a database of the abuses of smallholder employers, of the casual workers, the beating ups, the violence against women and children, and raise awareness about these problems among the so-called smallholder population in order to address issues of accountability? And that, raises, broader issues of views of the world and how we understand development and transformation and so on. We don't agree. We don't all have the same views of the world. And the reason I'm insisting so much on the question of evidence, methods, and rigor is that we have to put our cards on the table and say where we are, how we situate our own research, which are our ideological premises, our assumptions. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to live in this illusion of consensus, which is no more than an illusion. And I think my worry, and that's why I raise some of these concerns, is that some of these big numbers and so on are just masking and concealing some of these very fundamental disagreements, which have to be addressed. They don't have to be resolved. They have to be addressed at the very least. Just let me remind you, for example, of an old debate. A lot of people don't read. Reminds me of this the so-called Kenya debate, where a lot of scholars used to discuss, the progressive elements or not of capitalist development and the prospects for capitalist development in Africa, with examples from field research in Kenya. That debate died in the end. But I would suggest that one of the most interesting pieces of that debate was when Gavin Kitchen wrote in 1985 this piece on the method behind this debate and the reasons why this debate in the end died. So I'm just worried that some of these debates will die precisely because we don't really address these methodological issues head on.
I think one of the most difficult challenges that all of us face, or most of us face, and it's not a challenge that can be resolved, is to hold two contradictory ideas in our head at the same time. And the tension that I perceive here, I think, was encapsulated in Ben Cousins' comment about there are different kinds of research for different kinds of purposes that require different kinds of different levels of rigor, verification, and so on. The project of a globalizing of rigor, I think it is not simply not feasible. The misgivings that I have about the evidentiary basis of some of the reports are mixed with a great deal of admiration for what Brain in particular has done to bring this to public attention, and Land Matrix too. But I also recognize that the rigorous verification of land tenure questions is extremely labor intensive. And I was fortunate to work on this in a country in a setting where the access was relatively easy, and certainly in most places it was not. So it's extremely labor intensive, it's extremely problematical. The resources and the personnel are not available to globalize rigor. But that doesn't stop me from thinking that it would be a very good idea.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think this debate and discussion, we should thank the panelists particularly for their honesty and openness and willingness to have this debate, and to all of you for entering into it. This is one that's not going to go away, it shouldn't go away. And I think if this community can have that form of reflexivity about these sort of issues, then this debate will continue and not die in the way that other debates of a similar ilk have done in the past. So I'd really like to thank the panelists for offering this to us this afternoon.